Chapter 25, The Great Depression, Section 2, Roosevelt's New Deal. Franklin Roosevelt took office in March of 1933. During his speech, he said that economic recovery was possible and promised that the government would help people. Now, this map here that you're looking at here is the electoral map of that election of 1932, and you can see how much of a landslide it was and how much people really disliked Herbert Hoover. So Herbert Hoover only won 5 states: Pennsylvania, Connecticut, Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine, and Delaware, So he only received 59 electoral votes, where Roosevelt won everything else. He won 472 electoral votes. Landslide in elections. Popular vote, Roosevelt handily beat Hoover 57% to 40%. During Roosevelt's inaugural speech, he also made this very famous quote: "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." Roosevelt started off his presidency by calling a special session of Congress, and this became known as the 100 Days. The session started just after his inauguration and lasted until the middle of June. So this was the first 100 days of Roosevelt's presidency. The president and Congress worked together to create new economic programs to battle the Depression and aid economic recovery, and this became known as the New Deal. One of Roosevelt's first goals was to restore confidence in American banks, because we all know that the banks had started to close because they lost all their money, and people's money were left in there and they lost it all. So Roosevelt was going to order all banks to close, temporarily close. And Congress will pass the Emergency Banking Relief Act so that government can inspect the finances of all banks. And if the bank was deemed weak, then that bank would remain closed. And if the bank was deemed strong enough, then they would reopen. This became known as the banking holiday. This banking holiday was announced during one of Roosevelt's first Fireside Chats, which were basically a radio address in which he spoke directly to the American people. So here's Roosevelt speaking, have all the radio microphones up, people listening to it on the radio. Roosevelt will give many Fireside Chats over the course of his presidency. With these Fireside Chats, slowly Americans started to trust banks again, and they started to put their money back into banks. So over the next few months, over $1 billion was deposited back into banks by Americans. But not everyone will feel safe about that. And for a long time, people will store their money in their own homes, not in the banks. We're now going to run through a list of programs that were created to help with relief and recovery during the Depression. And so there'll be a name, and then there'll be an acronym right after it that would represent it. So the first one is the Civil Works Administration. That is called the CWA. It employed 4 million Americans into building roads and airports. You have the Civilian Conservation Corps, which is the CCC, that provided jobs to do outdoor projects such as planting trees or working on national parks. You have the Tennessee Valley Authority, the TVA, which hired people to build dams and generators to bring electricity to the Tennessee River Valley. Let's look at this picture here. Oh, there we go. Here's an example of the TVA. They built these dams right here, and then they used water for electricity, so it's called hydroelectricity, and that provided jobs building the dam and then running the dams, and it helped rural communities that were really poor to get electricity. Next, you had the Farm Credit Administration. This helped farmers refinance mortgages so that they could keep their farms, because many farmers were losing their farms because they couldn't pay their mortgages, and so the FCA helped with that. The Agricultural Adjustment Act, or the AAA, helped to stabilize agricultural prices by getting farmers to grow certain types of crops. So instead of every farmer in, let's say, the state of Iowa growing corn, they may say this farmer raises corn, this person does the wheat, this person does green beans, so on and so forth, to try to maybe make the demand for those crops greater by limiting the number that are grown. And you have the National Industrial Recovery Act, the NIRA, and it was an attempt to regulate businesses to raise prices, or to get businesses to raise prices. And this was supported by the first female cabinet member, Frances Perkins. This is Frances right here. Let's draw her picture out. There's old Frances right there. Now, with everything that happens, there's always going to be a critic about a program. It doesn't matter which president it is or what the program is. There's always going to be someone who's a critic. So we're going to talk about the critics of the New Deal. And the first one are the people who believe that the New Deal goes too far. It criticized the expansion of federal government, meaning federal government just becoming too powerful. The president was gaining too much power, and it potentially led to higher taxes for businesses. Now, you also have people who felt like the New Deal doesn't do enough or doesn't go far enough. For example, one of those guys is a U.S. Senator from Louisiana. His name is Huey Long. He proposed a program called Share Our Wealth, which would tax rich Americans and use the money to help poor people. He basically thought that every family would be guaranteed an annual income of $5,000. So, again, taxing the rich to take care of the poor. Some felt that the New Deal only helped business interests. One of those critics would be a father, a Catholic priest named Charles Edward Coughlin. And he felt that Roosevelt's programs only helped out the business interests. It didn't really help out the poor people of the country. FDR, Franklin Roosevelt, introduced additional legislation after the congressional elections of 1934. So this is the second half of his first term as president, and this became known as the Second New Deal. The First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt, that's her in the picture, was a very active supporter of these Second New Deal legislations. Here are some more New Deal programs that were passed in the second part of his term. The first one is the Works Progress Administration, called the WPA. It employed 8.5 million Americans to construct buildings and roads and other things across the United States. If you've ever been to New York City, Lincoln Tunnel was one of those work projects that were developed during the Depression era. And there is a dam in Washington called the Grand Coulee Dam that was also built during this time period. Now, Eleanor Roosevelt, again, a strong supporter of the New Deal programs, but she didn't feel like the Works Progress Administration really helped out young Americans in their teens or early 20s. So that's why another program was passed called the National Youth Administration, or the NYA, that gave part-time jobs to young workers. The National Labor Relations Act, also known as the Wagner Act, allowed workers to join labor unions. And probably one of the biggest programs that was passed during this time period was the Social Security Act. It worked to provide financial security for the elderly, the disabled, children, and unemployed by placing a tax on workers' and employers' wages. So essentially what this will do is that when you get to a certain age, you can retire and then receive a Social Security check. Also, if you get disabled, you can apply for Social Security. Children and unemployed workers can receive unemployment benefits through the Social Security Act. Now, this is a tax on your paycheck, so you get a paycheck. Not only is your income tax taken out, but you're also getting a tax taken out for Social Security. That money would be put into a pool for those who are planning on retiring, and then they retire, get some benefits, and someone younger can now take over a job. That was kind of the goal of the Social Security Act. The Congress of Industrial Organizations, the CIO, was a union that was based on industry not on your skill level, and allowed African Americans, Hispanics, women, and immigrants to be members. What I mean by industry, you would have all automobile workers in a union or teachers in one union. It didn't matter what your skill level was in those areas. It just meant that you were part of a group that is unionized. This led to many sit-down strikes, and one example of this would be the sit-down strike against General Motors, in which the workers in the factory refused to work but decided to stay in the factory so they could not be replaced by replacement workers. Anyway, here's a chart going back to all our New Deal programs. Some examples are some of the New Deal programs. There are more New Deal programs, but the general list of them: the Civilian Conservation Corps, Tennessee Valley Authority, the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, National Recovery Administration, Public Works Administration, FDIC. This is another important one. The FDIC protects your savings in banks. And today it's still around, so if you go to a bank and it doesn't have a sticker on the door somewhere that says it's FDIC approved, then you don't want to go to that bank. Securities and Exchange Commission, that's still around, the SEC, Federal Housing Administration, the Rural Electrification Administration, National Labor Relations Board, the Work Progress Administration, and of course the Social Security Act, which is still around today. Now, Roosevelt will have some issues with the Supreme Court. Now, he is reelected in 1936, again, by a huge margin, but he did have some issues with the Supreme Court. They were declaring some of his New Deal programs unconstitutional. For example, the AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, and the NIRA, both felt like they infringed on the rights of citizens, so they declared them unconstitutional. So Roosevelt tried to come up with a plan to stop the Supreme Court from declaring any more of his laws unconstitutional. He tried to reorganize the Supreme Court by expanding the number of Supreme Court justices to 15 from 9. And that meant that he could appoint 6 new justices. And by doing so, he would appoint people who would follow his way of thinking. And then the Supreme Court wouldn't declare any more of his laws unconstitutional. However, it was rejected. It was rejected by Congress. Now, this cartoon here kind of illustrates the whole idea, with Roosevelt appointing 6 new guys, and they're all like, yes, yes, we all vote yes, yes, we all vote yes. So that's kind of what Roosevelt was looking for. But Congress rejected this whole idea of 15 justices. This is what they called court packing, and that felt like Roosevelt would have a way far advantage when it comes to the separation of powers, and he'd be more powerful than the other 2 branches. However, the Supreme Court did not overturn any more New Deal legislation. That is the end of Section 2.